Hi, this is Nancy Ralphsma with On Point TV. We are at the end of our Lone Star lessons. So over the last couple of shows, we've actually finished the Lone Star. So this should look familiar to you. I'd gotten the quilt center done, but I had not done the border. And I'd not done the border because I wanted to do something special. I wanted to teach you mitered borders. Now, a lot of people are afraid of doing mitered borders. And pretty much it's because it's not that there's not good instructions out there, but they're all in a book. And something about reading the instructions in a book is just never going to be as helpful as actually seeing it in a video. I've taught this technique a lot of times, and it really, really works. So I'm going to start taking you through step by step on the making a mitered corner, the mitered border, but I first want to show you just a couple examples. So this is the mitered corner on this quilt. This is it here, all right? You'll notice that I've got 3 different fabrics. There's really 2 reasons why I'll do a mitered corner. One is if I've got a fabulous border fabric, and I'll show you an example of how you deal with a fabulous bordered fabric, but more times than not, it's 2 reasons. One, because I want to use more than 2 colors in my border. Sometimes a quilt just asks for it. It says, I need more than just 2 colors or just 1 color. The second reason is if you'll refer back to when I put the borders on the other quilts, and we do all that measuring on the quilt. So you got to measure it 3 times, and you got to pin it. Then you got to measure it 3 times, and you got to pin it. Then you got to measure it 3 times, and then you got to pin it. With a mitered border in this technique, you construct the border as just a strip set off of the quilt. You measure the quilt once, and you're pinning it onto the quilt once. So really, if you're planning more than 1 or even 2 borders, if you're thinking to do a design with 3 borders, this technique is so much faster. I want to show you some examples of some quilts that I've done. So this is a real small little kid's quilt, but what I love about this particular example is you can truly see the miter because I have this kind of dark and light, which if you've ever made an attic window quilt, this is the same technique, and in this quilt here, it's actually the same concept. So this is the dark and the light. That's your mitered border. Here's a couple of other examples. On this one, I really like it because I wanted additional fabrics. So I've actually got, this border was put on straight, but the blue, the black, the peach, and the black, that's 4 borders. If I had done that one at a time on the quilt, it would literally have taken me about 4 times longer to do the border. Here's a quilt with a just simple 2 colors, but I've done the mitered border on there. This one's a little bit trickier. This is a mitered border, but this the gold part here, that's actually machine appliqued, and then the mitered border brings them both together. This is going to be similar to the technique that I'm going to show you when I show you how to use a border print on a mitered border. And this is my last one. And again, this has 3 fabrics. I've got the dark teal, the gold, and then the print. Putting those 3 together and then putting them onto the quilt. When we come back, I'm going to take you through the steps one at a time. So this is the quilt that we're going to actually work on. I just pulled it out of my stash. I guess that means I have too many UFOs, which is probably a true thing. So we're going to work on this quilt. The first thing that you want to do is decide what colors you want to do. I do want you to try to be creative, maybe go outside the box when you're thinking about what borders you put on. As I pull these over here, and you're going to realize that I really wasn't that creative with this. I've got a red, white, and black quilt, and I made a red, white, and black border. When I was putting that, so I lay all my colors down, decide what I'm going to do. The next step is to measure the quilt. So this quilt happens to be square, so I only have to measure one side. But if you're working on a rectangular quilt, like a bed quilt, you want to measure the longest side and use that side for most of your measurements, okay? So I'm going to take this. This measures about 36.5 inches. So that means that my first border, in this case this white one, needs to be at least 36 inches plus the width of the border times 2. So in this case, this border is a 1.5 inch. I cut it 1.5 inches. So 36 inches plus 1.5 plus 1.5. So that's 39. And then add at least 2 to 4 inches on top of that. So I cut this white strip 39 plus 4, 43 to 44 inches, all right? Doing math in my head, this is not very easy. So then my next border, I wanted to start thinking about it getting bigger and bigger because a mitered border actually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The next border was a 2.5 inch one. So if I had that 44 inches, now I have 44 inches plus 2.5 plus 2.5. So I'm up to 44, 6, 8, 49 inches plus a couple of extra inches, so 51. The last border is 6 inches. So now math is getting really hard. So I had 51 inches plus 6 inches plus 6 inches. So 51, 57, 63 inches plus 3 or 4 inches on top of that. So I'm going to say 66 inches. All right. Now I did all that math on camera, so I hope you're as impressed with me as I am with me right now, having done all of that. I took those strips and I cut them, and now I'm going to put them together, which is really just a basic strip set, but you want to make the strips be centered. So here you can see the white strip is shorter than the red and then the black, so that they're kind of tapered down on the ends. I sewed all 4 of them that way. And now the trick is the pressing. 2 of the borders, usually the 2 sides, it really doesn't matter, but in this case I've chosen the 2 sides. I press the seams out. On the top and bottom border, which should be one of these, I press the seams in. So my 2 side borders have the seams pressed out. The top and bottom border have the seams pressed in to the inner border. So inner border in, outer inner border out. All right. Once we have the strip sets made and they're all pressed, the sides out, the top and bottom in, you're ready to sew it onto your quilt. So we have the quilt, the borders ready. They're all pressed in the direction that they need. So now we need to measure the quilt exactly. Up until now, I've been doing math in my head and, ½ inch or 1 inch, not a big deal as long as I made it bigger than I needed it to be. When it comes time to actually put it on the quilt, you need to be exact. As always, with borders on a quilt, measure 3 times and then pin, pin, pin. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to measure this one time because I have measured this one a few times now. It is 36.25 inches, and I had done that all 3 times and all of the measurements were the same. So now I take that measurement, 36.25 inches, and because this quilt is square, I get to do all borders at the same time. I'm going to lay them down one on top of another. Now, I'm going to take the ruler, and so this is like my trick for not having to do math in my head or to pull out my calculator. 36.25 inches divided by 2. I don't know, and that's all right. I don't need to know. I'm going to take my measuring tape. I'm going to take the end of it and bring it right to 36.25 inches and fold it in half. Now I lay that half down right on the fold of the border. So I literally folded the border in half. I'm going to put the measuring tape right on the fold, bring it on over. There's 36.25 inches. Now I'm going to mark 1/4 inch less. So looking at my measuring tape right now, 1/4 inch less than 36.25 inches is 36. So I'm going to mark right there. Now with my scissors, I'm going to nip in at 1/4 inch. That little bit is what's going to make it so that it's possible for me to turn the corner, if you will, with the mitered border. So again, I measured the quilt. It was 36.25 inches, folded it in half so that my borders are folded in half. My measuring tape is folded in half. Place the fold on the fold, my measurement of 36.25, minus a 1/4 of an inch. That's where I put my mark, and that's where I nipped my borders. So now I'm ready to pin the border onto the quilt. So here is that little nip that I have right there. Remember that? Now, on the corners of the quilt, I put a pin at a 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. So that's what those pins are, a 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. Now I take my border, lay it down, match my center, pin that. Then I'm going to bring it over to the end. And on this end, I'm going to flip this down so you can see that little nip that I made. And I'm going to match that nip up with that 1/4 inch pin. So now you can see that the nip is a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the quilt. I'm going to pin that. As always, I'm going to put lots and lots of pins all throughout here. So I'm just going to do just these for now, but you know I'd probably put 8 in that section alone. Now I'm going to come to the other side. There's my pin that's a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Fold it down for that little nip. Now line that nip up with the pin. So now the nip is a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. Transfer the pin to the top. And then I will continue to pin throughout this before I sew. But I do have a smaller quilt we're going to do this on, so it'll go a little bit faster. So I've pinned it down, and I've already, on this particular quilt, I told you I was going to work on a different quilt. I already did one of the corners, so now I'm going to work on another one. So when it comes time to do the second one, you're going to take the border that you've already sewed and pull that out of the way. So I'm just folding that out of the way. Now I can bring this back in, do that same 1/4 of an inch from the edge, so that this is a 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now it's time to sew. Now when I sew this, I'm going to start sewing off the border. So there's that 1/4 inch, but I'm going to start sewing a few stitches before that, sew all the way to the end, and when it comes to the end, I'm going to fold that out of the way and sew off it there too. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine. So I'm going to start sewing on the green fabric in this case. Whoops! I need to set myself up with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I'm going to sew, and I'm going to start on the green fabric and then sew into the gold fabric. Right there. And I've put quite a few pins in here, and this is just a little tiny quilt, so it really doesn't require as many pins as if you're doing a large quilt, so kind of keep that in mind. Now I'm coming to the end. So right here, I'm going to flip the border out of the way so that when I'm sewing, I'm going to sew all the way down onto the green fabric off the border. And come to the end and cut my thread. And take my pins out here. You can see how this is going to look so far. So this is looking good. So now my next step is to miter this corner right here. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. So now we have the strips on, and it's time for us to prepare this seam to make the miter. So this is how I do it. I do want you to keep in mind that I'm doing this on a small quilt, and it is more difficult to do it on a large quilt. It only makes sense because when you're doing this and you're holding it up, it is a lot of quilt, but no, it can be done. All right. So with this one, I have this one with the seams pressing up, this border. The under quilt, the seams are pressing down. What that means is, just like in everything that you do in quilting where you try to butt the seams together, I'm going to be able to butt these seams together to get them to match up beautifully. So this one is up, that one is down. I can feel it with my fingers. Yep, those are together, nestled quite nicely. Then the second one. and then the third seam. So I'm obviously going to pin every seam because I want them to stay exactly where I put them. Now, it'd be awesome if that's all you had to do, but it really is never that easy, right? You can't just expect that they're going to all be lined up perfectly, so that's when you use your ruler. So I'm going to grab my long ruler here, and I love this one because it has the 45-degree angles going in both directions, so it makes it easier. You don't got to flip the ruler so much. I'm going to lay this down. I'm going to try to make sure that the border is actually laid flat and straight, which is a really nice thing about having an ironing board like this, because I have a big, flat, straight edge surface. So this is laid down nice and straight. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line the edge of the ruler up with the fold of the fabric. Now the quilt, or the fold of the quilt, and this is folded on the diagonal. Now I'm going to bring it all the way up to the top. And I'm going to make it sure so that the edge of my border is running on that 45-degree angle. The fold of the quilt is on the edge of the ruler. Now I'm going to get a marking tool. I'm going to mark that. Right next to the ruler, nice and straight, making sure nothing's moving while I'm doing the drawing. And you can see that line. I'm going to put one more pin in the corner there. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine to sew it. Now I've got my sewing machine set up so that it is stitching in the middle. I got to move my needle over here a second. And my stitch length is going to be down one bop on my machine. So I'm to a 2.0 stitch length. I want this to be a smaller than normal stitch length. And I'm going to start sewing right on the edge. I'm going to go a couple of stitches and then I'm going to reverse and then go forward again. I want that to be very secure on that very corner. When I come to the seams, I want to be very cautious that I keep the seams facing in the direction that I originally pressed them. Move him out of the way. And when I come to the end, again, I'm going to do a couple of little back stitches right there, just to make that really secure on the end. So now I've sewn right on that line. Take my pins out. And before I cut it, I do want to test and make sure that I actually sewed what I thought I sewed. I can open that up and look at that. That looks good. So I'm going to fold it back. I'm going to cut this off. So I'm going to cut it off with maybe about a 1/2 inch seam allowance and straight at the edge. And from the back side, I can press it open. So it's kind of nice that all along the Lone Star, everything in the Lone Star for the most part, except for the borders, we've pressed the seams open. Well, the same thing with a mitered border. You want to press the seams open so it eliminates some of that bulk and so you're able to match those seams up. After I've pressed it, I'm going to take some spray sizing because I want it to stay in place. I want it to be nice and crisp. Which brings me to pressing. You know, people just don't spend enough time. Students are, they're done. No, it's not. If you haven't left that iron on there for at least 10 seconds, you're not pressing it enough. I do honestly think, and I'm not bragging, but I think that's one of the reasons why my quilts have a tendency to look very nice and neat, because I truly spend an awful long time pressing my seams, which is why in my studio I have a TV sitting right in front of my ironing board so that I can watch a show while I'm pressing and not be totally bored. All right, so I guess I've pressed that long enough now. We're going to flip it over and see how that looks. Looks pretty cool. So I would do that to all 4 sides, all 4 corners, and have my mitered border. When we come back in a second, I want to show you how you do a mitered border. It's kind of a tricky little thing we've come up with for doing a mitered border using a border print. Now I want to show you how to do a mitered border if you're using a border print. So this is what we would call a border print. That's going to be something that has the design looks like you've got additional borders. The first thing I would tell you when using a designed border print is to tear the fabric. Border prints are going to be printed along the length of the fabric, so along the selvage edge. The best, most accurate way is to tear it. So you nip it and tear that fabric. Remember I taught you earlier that when tearing the length of grain, you're going to get your straightest cut. So this has been torn. I've got these two borders, so I want you to imagine that I've put this on a quilt. The idea here, is that I want to be able to line up the designs. I want that orange design, that line, to line up beautifully, and to try and get some of these to match. Well, it's not really that easy. The first thing that you want to do, well, you've got to use some math putting it onto the quilt, figuring out just the right size of quilt that a border like this can fit on. And then I'm going to take my borders after I've put them on. So I've sewed them on that 1/4 of an inch from the edge and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to press the top piece at a 45-degree angle. Now this would be attached to the quilt, both of these would. But the idea here is to line it up so I can see that the design is matching. Whoops, I'm not quite sure why that's not quite matching. All right, there. I got to press it under a little bit farther. And then to be sure that I'm at the 45. So instead now of using my long ruler, I'm going to use a square ruler. So on this square ruler, I put a piece of the glow tape on the bottom of it so that it's right on the center, the diagonal seam. I'm going to lay this down on top of it. And I'm going to just look at some of the design elements. So I've got this line and this line. Those are running true on the ruler. And then I need the diagonal to run true to the diagonal. There. So now the diagonal fold is right on the diagonal of the ruler and the other seams are running straight. Carefully move the ruler away. Put a pin to hold some of it. But this is the tricky thing. Instead of trying to flip this over and sew it from the back side, you're going to sew it from the front side. So use some of your Wonder tape. So this is a water-soluble double stick tape that does not need to be pressed to activate. So there are tapes out there that need to be pressed to activate. Not that they don't work. This one is just so much more convenient because it doesn't have to be pressed. I'm going to flip this up, lay the double stick tape down. Just pressure sense it down. Oops, right there at the end. There she is. Peel it up. Now I'm going to put it right back into the design so that I've got in particular those orange lines. Sometimes it means you're shifting it up and down to make it work, to get those designs. Now the designs up here at the top are not quite what I'd want, but I think you get the idea. Stick them down right there. Now I can go to the machine and stitch it from the top. So I'm going to use my invisible thread on the top and my teeny tiny zigzag. So this is technically invisible machine applique. So if you refer back to the On Point lesson episode 108, I take you through a lot of different techniques on doing invisible machine applique, and one of them is the stitch. So it's a very small stitch length, maybe 1.0 length, maybe 0.8 wide, and I zigzag on and off that line. That way I'm sure that I'm getting these designs to match up just the way I'd like them. So I taught you a couple of different techniques on doing a mitered border. I really hope that you enjoy trying these on your quilts, and I sure would love to see some of your photos of your finished quilts. Have a great day. I hope you like this video. Please like our videos and subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions, just leave me a comment. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can.